Thank you very much. After those kind of introductions, I'm like, boy, I really want to hear this guy talk. And then I realize it's me, and I'm like, it's not all it's cracked up to be, but I'll do my best. Can you all hear me okay? Okay. Today, I'd like to introduce primary care behavioral health, but I'd also like to intermingle my journey, the story of how I ended up there, not just professionally, but also from a sense of vocation. Before that, let me tell you about some other kind of, I like to give people a little bit of context to where I am today, and one of the most important parts of me is my family. And this relates to being back here at Wheaton, which feels a little weird. Haven't been back in a long time. And Wheaton's a special place because I met my wife here of now 13 years, Karen, and we have 3 children, ages 6, 4, and 2, Emma, Sophia, and Caleb. And for those of you who are parents in the room, you understand that I have no life whatsoever, and that this is actually probably the most fun thing I'll get to do all week. So thank you again for the invitation. We're going to start today at the end of my journey, talking about primary care behavioral health and what it is that I do on a daily basis along with my staff. And I'm going to show you a brief video here that's going to detail for you the work that we do at Access Community Health Centers in Madison. Before that, let me just set a little bit of context for these kind of phrases that we throw about. Federally qualified health centers are actually a little known but really important entity nationally. Essentially, these are nonprofit community health centers, primary care clinics, who engage in this basic agreement with the federal government. And the government says, we will give you what's called cost-based reimbursement, meaning we will pay for all your costs in providing primary care services for your patients, whereas the community members get lower rates for Medicaid and Medicare. But you're going to get the full costs, but the trade-off is that you also have to be responsible for serving the uninsured as well. So these community health centers have it as part of their mission to serve the uninsured and the underinsured, folks with government-type insurance. And this is important because it's actually a nationwide network. So if any of you ever, and you probably will at some point in your life, find yourself without health insurance and you need some primary care services, all you have to do is Google the name of the state and Primary Care Association, and you'll find a website with a list of health centers in any state in the United States that will be able to serve you. And this, so this serves basically as a nationwide network. And it's interesting that we haven't, it doesn't come to the forefront in our discussions on healthcare reform, but it's always been lurking there. In fact, both Republican and Democratic administrations have continued to fund federally qualified health centers over the years. So Bush did, Clinton did, Obama did. It seems to be a growing entity. And I'm very, very proud to work at a community health center. I've now worked at 2. Bob talked about Lawndale Christian Health Center on the west side of Chicago, where I got my start in primary care. Wonderful place where I learned a lot, kind of a baptism by fire. Developed a primary care behavioral health program there. And then when my wife and I moved to Madison, Wisconsin, so that she could finish up her residency in emergency medicine, I basically just kind of showed up at the doorstep of this community health center. I knew there was one. I basically talked to the executive director and said, hey, this is what I do. And the great thing about community health centers is you can get things like this done, and you can provide quality care. I'm guessing that for most of us here, if we go to our insurance company or our primary care clinic, that we're not going to have a visit with a primary care physician and a psychologist in the same room at the same time on the same visit, right? but that's what we're able to do at community health centers. So we're not just providing this kind of low-level care. We're actually, in many ways, providing better care. And what's awesome about that is we're providing the best care for the least of these. And I think that speaks volumes. So my hope today is twofold. One, I'd like to get whoever in the room has a proclivity towards primary care work, I'd like to get you excited about it. The other is I'd like to talk about my journey, not because it in and of itself is interesting, but because it serves as a bit of an exemplar of the development of a psychologist who is a Christian. And I'd like to help you to be reflective about some of the points at which my development took off or was hindered, so that in some ways you can reflect on your own development as a psychology student at any level. Now, one caveat is I don't want to convey that I think that everybody's going to land in the same place, particularly as far as their faith and their faith worldview as I have. You're going to get to your own places in that. But I want you to pay attention to the journey and the pieces therein. So without further ado, I'm going to show this video. Hopefully it works. And then we'll move forward. Results of integrated care program. Here we go. There's a basic problem with the mental health care system, which we have for a long time blamed on a lack of funding. And I think that what we're finding out as we see the outstanding results of integrated care programs, that money is not the only factor involved here. It's the fundamental structures of a mental health care delivery system that are the main problem.
The statistics are astounding. The U.S. mental health care system, comprised of disparate agencies, community mental health centers, and other providers, serve only half the mentally ill in the population. Of those, more than 50% are actually served by the primary care system.
So as primary care providers began to make noise about the reality they were facing of becoming mental health providers, writing the most scripts, for example, for depression medication of any provider type in the nation, facing patient resistance to going to specialists, and in many cases facing the reality that patients have no options in their community for mental health services, this idea came about regarding integrating mental health services into the primary care environment. Out of that came the primary care behavioral health model.
Research estimates that anywhere from 15 to 60% of patients do not complete a referral to a mental health specialist. More recent research shows that patients prefer and adhere to treatment provided by and in their primary care clinic.
As a behavioral health consultant, we work really closely with the primary care providers within the clinic, providing same-day appointments, providing real-time feedback and communication with providers as well as the patients, really focused assessment as well as interventions on the same day, and really trying to work together to come up with a solution.
Logistically, it usually works that if it's a patient that I've been seeing and you all have had relationships with, had connections with already, I'll usually go in and see the patient, follow up, see how things are going, and then go touch base with the behavioral health folks, kind of catch them up about what I've found about how things have been going, and then they'll usually go in to see them afterwards, and then we may touch base afterwards, maybe to change medicines, maybe to let each other know what we sort of learned, and then to continue on with care that way.
We both have scheduled appointments and as well as warm handoffs from providers. So we'll see occasionally some patients that are on our caseload, but then go ahead and see ones that have presented to their primary care provider and then somehow they've had some kind of behavioral intervention or mood symptom that they feel like may be helpful to have behavioral health work with them.
I think we see a large variety of cases in the primary care setting, which is, I think, very enjoyable. We can see anything from kind of general coping with life, coping with a small stressor here or there in someone's life, through anxiety, through depression, all the way up to more severe and persistent mental illness. We see families, we see kids. We'll talk about parenting issues with families. We talk about ADHD if that's an issue. We also end up going through a lot of dialogue with the providers to help home manage a lot of these interventions. We try to provide support to the providers for medications, but at the same time addressing our own concerns in terms of behavioral changes that patients can make, and trying to give some coaching in that regard.
Follow-up really kind of depends on the need. If we're able to come in and feel like we can get some positive momentum, we might follow up in 2 or 3 weeks. If the patient feels more stable and they're doing well, they may be occasional follow-ups months from now. It really depends on the need of the patient as well as what the providers see our role is and what they need us to do to follow.
The behavioral health consultant provides focus assessment and intervention in a fast-paced format that provides recommendations for the patient and their provider immediately. Care is initiated quickly and followed consistently using the stepwise care model that is familiar to the primary care provider. Because visits are focused, a behavioral health consultant can see many more patients in a typical day, often between 8 and 12 patients in an 8-hour day.
We can see anywhere from 6 to 12 patients in a day, depending on what the flow is like, how many other primary care providers are here, depending on how many referrals we'll get, as well as how full our schedule is for the scheduled patients, not including the more handoffs. We're really visible. We try to make sure that we have a really good working relationship with them, educating them about what behavioral health services are, what we can do to improve their outcomes, make them more efficient, quicker, see patients moving from one to the next. We share office space with them. We sit in common areas. We provide immediate feedback after we see patients. So really making ourselves visible and an integral part of it too.
But I really enjoy that part of it too, because I like the fact that we can interface and we can have a dialogue about what's going to help the patient, and we can even end up talking about things that we wouldn't expect to, getting more into behavioral medicine kinds of things, which I really enjoy as well.
We definitely work out of exam rooms. We don't have our traditional office kind of tucked away. We really become part of the team, which helps reduce the stigma associated with traditional mental health, and so that they're just able to come to their doctor's office and receive mental health services where they may not have been able to access services otherwise. But being at the end of a hallway and having my own room wouldn't make me part of that team, and by not being part of the team, we're not able to serve as many patients. So that's one change. Making ourselves more visible, making sure that we're time efficient. That's a really important one. Not focusing on the traditional 50-minute hour, but making sure we're able to have a quick assessment, be able to provide interventions, and then feedback to the primary care provider is really important.
Our vision is for a 2-tiered system of care for mental and behavioral health issues in the United States. At present, we have an ineffective 1-tiered pseudo system that's simply not working. But we can actually help that system to work better if we were able to manage more patients in the primary care setting, which should be the first part of that 2-tiered system. So imagine if we had behavioral health consultants in every primary care practice. We'd be able to meet most of the mental health needs in the United States in that system. I believe probably in the range of 80 to 90% of the needs, relieving the burden on the specialty mental health care sector and allowing that sector to focus its efforts on the most severely mentally ill. And the kicker for me is not only is this a good idea, in practice, this is what most people want. They get to go home and tell their friends they just went to see their doctor, and in fact, that's what they just did, except that they also happen to have a visit with a behavioral health consultant as well.
Absolutely love it. I couldn't imagine being in traditional specialty mental health at this time. I love the pace, I love the variety of patients, I love the patient population that we serve, as well as working with the primary care providers because they really appreciate our input and our interventions in improving optimal outcomes for patients, which is the best part.
I like the fact that every day I come in, I don't know what exactly I'm going to encounter. It could be any of those things under the sun, or it could be something completely different that I've never even seen before, and I like that.
Well, it's easy to fit in. It's been very, very welcome. Partly because of the way our clinic works and the patients that we have, these issues are very common, and having the support of you all in terms of simple things, smoking cessation, medication compliance, that sort of stuff, to assistance with psych meds and making adjustments and all of that, to sort of being the kind of psychological support for the patient, which I've enjoyed being in the past, but in terms of timing and all of that, having the backup and having the support that you all give makes my day much smoother, much easier, just feeling much more supportive in terms of taking care of the patient in a very broad, holistic sense.
The primary care behavioral health model is working for many clinics across the country. mostly in the Veterans Administration and community health center systems, where integrated care has been mandated by the federal government. Challenges remain, however, as insurance and private care systems have conflicting incentives in the current healthcare marketplace to support integrated care.
This is fundamentally a healthcare redesign, and I believe it is an essential component of the medical home model. However, like all healthcare redesign, a lot is a change to make this a reality across the U.S. healthcare system. Funding structures have to change, higher education has to be changed to produce a capable workforce, mental health regulations that inhibit integration have to change, so a lot has to be done. But in the end, I'm confident that it will. I've worked in this model now for 8 years, and I see it work every day. This just makes sense. The guy is pretty good, isn't he? All right, so that's where I landed. I did not intend to land in primary care. In fact, during my training, I didn't even know that primary care was an option for a psychologist. I landed there kind of by accident. I had actually accepted a postdoc following my graduation here at Wheaton. And I quickly figured out, with the help of my wife at the time, that the kind of irritability that I was displaying was a sign that I was actually burnt out. And it was actually during a summer trip, right before I was going to start my postdoc, that she kind of confronted me with this reality. And I faced a very harsh reality at the time, and that reality was that I didn't know if I liked what I had spent the last 5 years training to do. And I was literally at the point of being ready to kind of give it up and consider other options. So after a few months of taking time off, I decided, by the way, not to take that postdoc, which was a very hard thing to do. The only time I've had to call somebody up and say, I think I'm going to quit before I even start. So it was very, very painful, but also one of the most important parts of my life. A few months later, I fell into this job. It's actually a job that I turned down several times as well. A couple of different avenues, people presented it to me, and I said, I'm not sure about working at that health center. I've heard it's a stressful place. I don't need any more stress in my life. But after a couple of people coming, I thought, well, maybe I should pay more attention to this. And it was the Lawndale Christian Health Center. It's in a neighborhood called Lawndale neighborhood on the west side of Chicago. Basically half African American, half Mexican immigrant community. And they wanted to start a pastoral care and behavioral health program. They'd been around for about 20 years at the time, well embedded in the community. Great community organization started by Wheaton grad coach Wayne Gordon. But they hadn't really gone into mental health. And their providers had talked to their administrator and said, hey, we're seeing people are crying in our exam rooms, we're seeing trauma, we're seeing anxiety and depression, and we don't have any backup, we don't have any support to help these folks. And so they gave me the task of starting up this program, which is really interesting because I had no experience in primary care. I literally had very little knowledge of medicine in general, the larger healthcare system. I was completely 100% unprepared. But the nice thing about that kind of thing is that's often when you get the most creative, right? You kind of can think out of the box from the get-go because you have no box to begin with. I failed miserably for the first 6 to 12 months because I did what any good psychologist would do. I asked them to take out an exam room, and I said, okay, well, take the exam table out and let's get rid of the sink. And then I said, well, I'm going to need furniture. They said, well, just go shopping. And I said, okay, I'm going to go to IKEA. So I outfitted the room with a nice rug, an accent light, some couches, some nice paintings on the wall, what any good kind of therapist would do. And I said, okay, I'm open for business. Well, as I said, it failed miserably. Even though there was tremendous demand, I mean, we're talking about a large clinic, probably at the time, 20 plus providers, easily. And so, thousands of patients. You'd think, boy, even if 1% were referred to me, that would be overwhelming to me. In fact, that was my fear at the time. And I originally talked to the executive, the CEO of the organization, and I said, look, I'm into going deep with patients. So my focus is going to be working with just a few families. And that's I want to go deep with these folks instead of seeing a bunch of people and getting myself all stretched out. I was completely ineffective because of the 50% of people that did get scheduled in my schedule, 50% of those didn't even show up. Why was this? Well, because I was selling something people didn't want. And that was a reality that really struck me. I was selling something, and I figured this out, getting to know the community, and then eventually just starting to hang out where the doctors were hanging out, and then being pulled in to see their patients, and realizing that it was much more acceptable to the patients for me to meet them in their exam room than to pull them out and kind of highlight the fact that they were seeing a shrink in a nice office with a nice couch for an hour at a time. Most of them didn't want to talk to me for an hour at a time. They wanted a certain amount, and that was good enough. And so my kind of boxes had to change dramatically. I had to learn about stepwise care, which is a primary care approach that's used. For example, if you go in and see your doctor for a skin condition, he's not going to throw a whole bunch of labs and tests your way. Your doctor's going to make an empirical guess at what's going on, and he's going to say, well, why don't you try this cream? I think it's this. Try this cream. If it doesn't work, in 2 weeks, let's get back together again and we'll rework it, right? And that's basically stepwise care. We as mental health professionals, by tradition, have developed a different way of doing it. We do a whole lot of upfront assessment. And I'm not encouraging you not to do well in your interviewing course, but if I was training you in my clinic, I would tell you that you don't have the luxury of taking 50 minutes to ask a bunch of questions, most of which are irrelevant to what the patient is presenting with that day. You have to be very good at kind of doing the thinking back here in the back of your head while you ask the relevant questions to that patient, and then formulate within that span of time, 15 to 30 minutes, something helpful for that patient that day. In other words, not this is your diagnosis and come in next time and we'll start working, which is one of the reasons for the attrition rate in mental health after that first visit. People don't feel like they got very much out of it. And in primary care, that's just not the way you do it. So I had to rework a lot of those boxes. And I can tell you from a personal standpoint that the other piece that was just absolutely mind-blowing for me was the experience of working with the underserved. And we're going to talk in more detail about this aspect. But I experienced a shift in my thinking, a shift in my faith, and really a core shift in my very person by participating in the sufferings of my patients, in being part of their lives, and as we'll talk about today, in participating in acts of shalom. But I didn't start out there. In fact, let's talk a little bit about where I did start out. Now, let me just kind of, assuming this comes up at some point here, let me just kind of put this into some sort of a context here. This is a little bit of an experiment. You all are going to be my guinea pigs today. I'm usually a PowerPoint guy, but I could not for the life of me put this into a PowerPoint format because it's not a sequential talk. This is about a journey that takes me back and forth to different pieces of my life. So we've talked about primary care. This is a mind map, what it's called. So we're going to go from kind of thought to thought, and I'm going to give you a sense of how my thinking developed over time. And as I said, we started out at the end here. We talked about primary care behavioral health. And by the way, for those of you who want the kind of a download of the mind map, you can copy this address down, and you can download it for yourself. And it's all one line. I couldn't figure out how to get it to go all the way to the right. And if you want the address at the end as well, happy to provide it for you as well. But I want to take us here to this part of my mind map on the development of faith worldview, because I found something really interesting when I first started working at Lawndale, a new professional right out of Wheaton. I found out something interesting about my thinking. So just imagine, and this is a composite case, a patient is referred to me. She's in an exam room. She's crying. The doctor comes out and says, look, I've got this patient. I've known her for years. She's like a rock in her family. She's never shown any kind of signs of depression or anything, but she's just in tears right now, and I'm not quite sure what to do. And I go in and start kind of uncovering that there is some history of lifelong trauma. There are actually some signs of depression. And through the course of in getting to know this individual in that visit, I hear that she has a boyfriend who she's sleeping with, right? Now, one of the really curious things to me that occurred in those initial kind of early encounters was this kind of thing in my head that said, well, if she's having premarital sex, that's probably something we should talk about because that might be key to what's going on here. Now, I really hope that you find that extremely absurd because it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever that would be where I start with this person. But in my head, for some reason, that was one of the things that kind of nagged at me. I was pinpointing a moral behavior as a place to start to help this person achieve a sense of wholeness in their life. And I had to do some work with that because it bothered me because I knew intuitively that doesn't make any sense. So in my actual interaction with the patient, that's not what I talked about. I connected with the individual. I connected with what was really going on in that person's life. I helped that person grapple with what they needed to do on a day-to-day basis to get through and to identify kind of a pathway to wholeness that encompassed a whole lot of other things. But I didn't stop and say, well, hold on a second. First of all, we've got to get your moral behavior in line in order for you to have any success here at overcoming any of these issues. It's kind of absurd. Well, where did that come from? Well, I realized over time that for me it came from my faith worldview. And I'll preface this by saying I'm going to talk about faith, different traditions, including the tradition that I grew up in, Pentecostalism. And I don't want to come across as demeaning at all. I appreciate many of the things that I got from my faith tradition over time, but I am going to provide some kind of critique here. So I had to kind of go back and kind of relook and say, well, what is my thinking here on this? Because there seemed to be like two parts of me there that were warring. And what I quickly realized is that a lot of it had to do with the fact that I didn't have much of a worldview. I had some core beliefs, but I wasn't able to kind of create a worldview out of those beliefs. And that affected also how I read the scriptures. And we're going to talk about that here in a moment. But let me just take a quick step back, and we're going to talk a little bit about history here. Because Pentecostalism, in which I grew up in, and I grew up in a particular brand of Pentecostalism, Latino Pentecostalism. I grew up in New York City in a urban neighborhood. And our church did a great job at providing a safe environment for us, and in many ways a nurturing environment. But it didn't do a very good job of providing a worldview. Why? Because we were taught the fundamentals of Christian faith. And that phrase is quite important, because as I learned here at Wheaton during my studies, that harkens back to fundamentalism, and in particular the fundamentalist modernist controversy in the later part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s, which was still had its kind of after effects even down to my generation. For those of you that don't know much about it, essentially this controversy was conservative Christianity pitted against and defending itself against modernity. Schools of theology were kind of picking apart the scriptures, using the historical criticism. Science, obviously, was picking apart the scriptures with the theory of evolution. And so conservative Christians felt attacked by modernity. And so there was this recoil, there was this retreat to the core fundamentals of faith. And we all know the core fundamentals of faith. If I asked you them, you'd probably be able to kind of detail them. You know, things like the inerrancy and infallibility of the scriptures, the historical reality of the birth, death, and resurrection of Jesus. For Pentecostals, we kind of added on to that, added on to the fundamentals, the baptism of the Holy Spirit with evidence and speaking in tongues, right? These core fundamentals. This was a defensive reaction. It was a way to define what a Christian was, and by default, what a Christian was not. And so what you had created there was this kind of in and out phenomenon. These are the in people because they believe in these core fundamentals. These are the out people. Now, one of the side effects that affected me in those exam rooms is the fact that those core fundamentals don't do very much for helping you engage the world. In fact, they're reactionary. They're about distinguishing yourself from the world. They don't give you a framework to think about how you engage the arts, how you engage literature or the sciences or your next door neighbor, aside from the core fundamentals, right? So if you think about, well, how would I engage my next door neighbor? What would you say? Right? Evangelism, right? So that's how I would engage my next door neighbor, because that's one of the few things that would tie in to that core set of beliefs. Now, evangelicals tried to grow from the fundamentals, but I think still, unfortunately, were hampered by those fundamentals in significant ways. So in the 50s, around there, you know, things like Christianity Today emerged, Fuller Theological Seminary emerged, and other Christian institutions founded by evangelicals, or what were called neo-evangelicals, basically to say, well, we do want to address the world in some way, but I think because the fundamentalist impact had been so great, and this development of worldview had not proceeded long enough, had not gone deep enough, evangelicals still had some really significant troubles with engaging the world. In fact, one of the exemplars I'll use here has to do with a dissertation that I produced for my doctoral degree on the Christian Association for Psychological Studies. And CAPS is an organization that still exists today that was not founded by evangelicals, actually. It was founded in 1954 by a small group of Dutch Reformed Calvinists in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Of course, it would be Grand Rapids, Michigan, if it's Dutch Reformed. And you can guess what college they started it at. And that's interesting because, again, in the midst of this fundamentalist modernist controversy, the evangelicals, fundamentalists, had this retreat. And so there's this period of time where there really was not a lot of engagement across the board. So the Dutch, though, were first to get at the idea of, well, maybe we have some way to engage the science of psychology. They were really the first to get there. And it's not surprising when you understand the Dutch tradition. First of all, they did not go through the fundamentalist modernist controversy in this country like the evangelicals did. They were protected by a couple of factors. One of the fact that they still had some recent immigrants. So the folks who founded CAPS were second-generation Dutch. And the Dutch had as their basic patriarch a man by the name of Abraham Kuyper. And Kuyper was an astounding individual. He did just about everything you could possibly do. He was a theologian, journalist. He actually served as Prime Minister of the Netherlands for a few years. His great contribution, though, to the Dutch, to the Dutch and their theology, was this idea of worldview. In fact, he had a phrase that the Dutch used as a mantra, some of which you can see reflected in the early CAPS literature. Every sphere of life, that is, that the Christian faith has to do with and impacts every sphere of life. There is nothing that is outside of the realm of our worldview. And that's why he was able to engage the arts, literature, theology, the sciences, politics, etc., etc. So the Dutch didn't have this retreat to the core elements that the fundamentalists did. Now, what happened later on in CAPS's history is pretty interesting. In the mid-70s, by then there had been a group formed on the West Coast called the Western Christian Association for Psychological Studies. And you would probably find some of the names familiar. Probably the most familiar would be James Dobson, for example, who was part of that organization, in addition to a lot of the folks out of Fuller Theological Seminary. Well, after a while, that organization grew to be very large as the kind of Christian counseling movement grew. And in fact, they outgrew the folks in Grand Rapids, Michigan. After a while, they decided it made sense to merge. Well, there was a problem. The Western folks, who were primarily evangelicals, were very suspicious of the Dutch because they did things that didn't look Christian, like smoke cigars and stuff like that. And they were suspicious of their faith statement. And so in the negotiations, in the merger, you see the fundamentalist impulse come out, this desire to establish what's in and what's out, and to protect the core aspects. And so they eventually, obviously, rectified it and came to some sort of a conclusion around it. But it serves as an exemplar for kind of the impact of the fundamentalist aspect of the evangelical worldview, even up and through to the 1970s. The Dutch, by contrast, and you can actually contrast, I won't go into too much detail here, but there's a sharp difference between what the Dutch produced early on as far as their conferences around engaging psychology. You had conferences that were much more fundamental, much more in kind of, for lack of a better term, at a deeper place than where the evangelicals took conference topics later on that became much more pragmatic and much more kind of professional in nature. So the impact of your worldview, so the key take-home point here is profound as far as how you're going to engage the sciences. Now, I want to make a quick side point here as well, because I don't want to leave it out. I think it's an important piece. American evangelicalism has not just been affected by its heritage in the fundamentalist modernist controversy, but it's also been affected by something called the American way of life. And here's a couple of exemplars here. Will Herbert, who wrote a book in the 50s called Protestant Catholic Jew, a really great book. He's a sociologist, and he detailed essentially the development of Protestantism and Catholicism and Judaism and contrasted them during that period of time, during the 40s and 50s. And what he found was that the American way of life had this kind of leveling effect, kind of this melting pot effect on culture, on cultural groups, so that, by third generation, really a lot of immigrant groups lost their ties and roots to their core cultures. But he also found that to be true also with religions. And in fact, he uses a great quote from Dwight D. Eisenhower at the time, and I'm going to paraphrase it here, but it goes something to the effect of, faith is important and crucial to America and Americans, and I don't care which one it is. Right? Is this idea that it's just it's all the same kind of stuff, right? And that Americanization has to do a lot with the radical individualism and the kind of individual freedom focus that is really inherent in the kind of grain of America. Now, I'm not saying that's good or bad, but what I am saying is that that has had a profound impact on American evangelicalism. American evangelicalism is quite an individualized form of religion. If you have any doubts about that, you can just look and see how many denominations we have, how many the proliferation of books about how to make your journey work and things like that. So radical individualism in our cultural landscape has impacted our faith as well, and that impacts our faith tradition as well. Now, interestingly enough, this is also true of psychology. Philip Cushman wrote a book called A Cultural History of Psychotherapy in America, a really great book that I was first exposed to in my History and Systems course here. Radically started reorienting me. And his critique is kind of the same, along the same lines. What he said was, this American way of life, this individualism, and in fact this consumerism as well, creates this kind of empty self phenomenon. And not only that, and he kind of gave the image of the Marlboro Man as the kind of prototype American. But not only that, but he said this empty self is actually reified by the healing technologies that we've developed. In other words, psychotherapy, psychiatry as we practice it today. And Cushman's critique was, maybe we need to rethink some of our healing technologies, because what we're doing is, in a way, making people better empty selves. By taking them out of their context, sitting them in an office with a stranger, talking in a kind of sterile environment on their own about how to better cope with the fact that they don't have community in their life. The fact that there is a kind of social emptiness that's caused by this radical individualism, right? Now, some of that kind of sad critique, at least from my vantage point, could probably also apply to a lot of our evangelical kind of traditions, which result in a lot of consumerism, right? I mean, we've all done it. I'm not here preaching as someone who's above it. We've all gone church shopping, right? We're all looking for what's going to fit us the right way. Kind of gone are the days when you've got a parish and that's where you go because that's where you grow up and that's where your neighbors go and that's what it is. So the American way of life has had a profound impact on our faith. And all of this impacted my faith worldview and development. So let me get to kind of where I've begun to land a little bit more. And this started with a rereading of the scriptures. See, one of the issues, particularly with fundamentalism in this retreat to the core that I'm talking about, that impacted me so far as, what I was thinking in an exam room with a patient, is that, most of us we don't read the Bible first and then are taught the core fundamentals. We learn the core fundamentals and then read the Bible. And that impacts how we read the Bible. I had to go back and, in a very painful way, quite honestly, in a personal, spiritual way, go back and reread the scriptures without a lot of the kind of overlay of my faith tradition and a lot of the overlay of my American worldview, as best as I could do that. And here's what I landed on. I figured something really crucial out. I want you to pay real close attention here, okay? Because this might be the most important point in the entire talk. This will shock you, but the Bible is not about me. Nobody's fallen out of their seats. No, and I'm being a little bit facetious there, but not really, because in my faith tradition, this highly individualized faith tradition, I kind of thought that the Bible was about me, that it was God. It was like God wrote something so that I could read it, because it was just for me, right? And I'd open the book sometimes, a lot of us have done it. I hope I'm not the only one here, but you open it up, you're going to do your daily devotions, and you open it up you're like, oh, I hope this is a good one today. And then you get to the kids thrashing against the rocks and you're like, what is he trying to tell me, right? Now that's, I'm being silly about it, but at its core, that's what happens, and that's a remnant of fundamentalism. We're treating the Bible in ways that are a result of the defense that early conservative Christians put in place. So the Bible, I figured out, is not a devotional book. It's not a book to kind of sit there and say, well, what does God have to say to me today? It's not a science textbook. It's not a book that says, this is the way that physics operates in this universe. It's not a complete anthropology. And that's the one that really messed me up, because when I came to Wheaton, I thought I was going to be taught a Christian psychology. I thought I was going to come here and get what that was. And I was disappointed during my first few years here, because I was like, there is no psychology here. Where's the Christian psychology? This looks like what's done at any other university, right? I kind of expected some kind of Christian gloss there that wasn't there. Now, this is not to say that this demeans the scriptures. In fact, I would say that it actually elevates the scriptures to its rightful place. It's God's word. Plain and simple. It's God's word. And we need to read it as such, not overlay it with these expectations. And something that my pastor likes to say, that I repeat a lot when I read the scriptures to myself, is that the Bible was written for us, but not to us. So one of the steps we have to take to reread the scriptures is understand that this was written, Paul's epistles were written to certain Christian believers who would understand it in a certain way, in a certain cultural context. So it takes some work to kind of understand what Paul is trying to say. The Psalms are their own form of literature. We have to understand what kind of literature that is and respect it for what it is. And it's really helpful, and what I found most helpful was that I started to reinterpret passages of Scripture that I would often look at and think of as kind of reifying this in and out mentality. We're this in group. Those are the out group. We're in, they're out. particularly if you read the Gospels. And when I started rereading the Gospels, I was kind of shocked because I didn't hear words that I expected to hear. Where is kind of personal Savior? Where is that language? Where's the language of condemnation? And this emphasis, particularly in my faith tradition, on people kind of going to hell. Right? You read the scriptures, a lot of that's, these are minor points. But in my faith tradition, they were major points. They were something you heard about every single week. Right? But you didn't hear about the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the earth. And if you did, you heard of it in a spiritualized manner. Blessed are the poor in spirit, so we take Matthew's, not the other translations. Blessed are the poor in spirit, because we don't want to mess really with the poor people. Why? Because that's what people on the out-group do, right? The liberals are the ones that deal with that kind of stuff. We know better, right? We know that back to our fundamentalist tradition, that salvation is an escape plan from a dying earth, right? In fact, there's a quote from D.L. Moody back in the 40s, I believe it's 1940s, where he says, paraphrasing again, "This earth is a sinking ship. We need to save as many as we can before it sinks all the way." So obviously you're going to have trouble engaging anything if that's your perspective, and that dominates your perspective. Now, let me get to what I kind of landed on as I reread the scriptures, and what began to help me as I faced each individual in each exam room. I began to understand that there were some central concepts in the scriptures. There's a thematic centricity of this idea of shalom. And boy, this hits you over the head if you just read the scriptures longitudinally or sequentially, right? Because it starts out that way. This is the beginning of the book. It talks about how good everything was. Now, shalom is not just peace, and it's not the absence of things. Shalom is the presence of justice, of righteousness. It's the presence of the right stuff. Why? Because things are ordered the way the creator, artist ordered them. Jesus takes this concept again and uses the phraseology of kingdom. That's one of the things I loved about Wheaton, for Christ and his kingdom. Always a reminder of what God was bringing to the earth, right? Because it's not, salvation is not really, you're being saved to something. It's not the end goal, right? And what are we being saved to? We're being saved to shalom, a place where there's justice between men and women, between races, between humankind and the planet. It encompasses the entirety of God's creation. Shalom is what God is after. So the book begins there. It also ends there. So the lasting image in Revelations is the image of Shalom. He's at the center of the city, and he's like a light that kind of flows out and feeds and illuminates everyone. Or like a river flowing from the center of the city, breathing life. Right? This is the images that the scriptures give us. Right? So there's this thematic centricity, and so this is where kind of I began to rework my thinking. I began to identify more with God as Father, and I like to use the term artist, just personally speaking, because it connotes a little bit of a nuance that I like to think about when I think about God. And that nuance is that this artist is a passionate creative force. And this creator is so passionate that when sin, and I note that I put here capital S sin, capital S sin is the actual issue, the actual disease that the Bible says has afflicted the human race. And that is essentially, again, detailed in the first few chapters, that we want to be like God. that we want to be the masters of our own domain. Right? That's the fundamental thing. That's what Jesus died for. Right? To rectify and reorder that aspect of human life. He did not die for particular sins. And again, because I lied to my sister yesterday, that's not why God needed to die on the cross. Or because I ran a red light on purpose, you know. And I don't want to make light of the potential consequences or power of particular sins, but they're not what the actual problem is. The actual problem is a sin, capital S, not lowercase s, not particular sins, but the sin that exists in man's rebellion, in the fact that we don't accept the order that God put there. We don't accept Shalom. But he comes after us, passionately and heroically, and in fact, in this part I will never understand, he creates a community of Shalom to work to spread Shalom. So he involves us in that kind of recreation, that restoration project. Now, I'm never going to understand that, because if I was God, I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have taken that route, because we don't have a very good track record. But you know what? This is where God as Father comes in. And when I first started having children, and I really realized that I fundamentally changed at my core understanding of God. Because I realized, you know what, that's what I would do with my kids. You know, when I'm trying to teach my kids something, I don't do it for them. I involve them in it. I participate in it. I participate in their sufferings, too, at times. So they see that I'm right there with them, that I care about them, but that I also want them to learn and to partner and to grow. And this Creator wants that for us. And the whole kind of rejection thing is interesting, because it's not so much that the Creator rejects those sinners. It's that just by the nature of the way things are, if you reject Shalom, you are dead. You can't live outside of Shalom. That's not the way you were made. No community, no individual is made to live outside of Shalom. And that's why it starts that way in the beginning. As sin enters in, you will die, right? Jesus reiterates this kind of phraseology in the famous passage around John 3:16 and forward, 17, 18, 19. Reread that for yourself, and you'll see this emphasis, that the light has come into the world, but men have rejected it. So their condemnation is themselves. They condemn themselves. It's like saying, if you don't breathe, you will die. It's just a law. It's just the way it is, right? So when you center in on this concept of Shalom, it begins to help you then understand why God takes so much time talking to us in the Scriptures about the poor, right? Because if this issue of Shalom, which is the presence of justice and rightness, is not present among all people, then none of us have Shalom. And that's what Jesus was saying powerfully from the very beginning. Where was Jesus born? In a manger. Poor. How did Jesus live? A life of poverty. How did Jesus die? The victim of oppression and injustice. Who did Jesus hang out with? The ugliest people he could find. Who did he critique the most? The people who had the strongest, biggest walls around their community and said, we're in and you're out. his life and his teachings are a powerful explication of the kingdom, which is the entrance of Shalom to this world. And his point was, if your brothers and sisters, who are my brothers and sisters? Who is my neighbor? It's a Samaritan woman. It's an immigrant. It's someone of a different faith. It's a poor person. It's a medically underserved person. It's a person in jail. It's a person with no father or mother. Right? If Shalom is to be here, well, we all have to have it. Because Shalom is not an individual thing. And this again goes back to the issue of worldview. American Christianity, unfortunately, has a very strong emphasis on internal peace. So when you talk about Shalom in a worship service, you're often talking about how you feel in here. But that's not really what Shalom is. That might be a consequence of Shalom, but that's not what Shalom is. Shalom is when you and your brother and sister are right. When there's justice, there's a quality of justice there that is right between the two of you. That's Shalom. Now, I felt this profoundly when I started working at Lawndale, because that was not my perspective at all. My perspective was, and I will embarrass myself, and it's on a video recording too here, but my perspective was that of I don't want to use kind of a very crass phrase, but basically a very rigid individual who believed that if you were poor, it's because you probably did something along the way to deserve it. If you were down and out, there was probably some particular sin in your life that you had to have dealt with. When I came face to face with my brothers and sisters in the Lawndale neighborhood that I didn't know I had, that all changed profoundly for me. They taught me about Shalom. And I experienced it in virtually every visit to an exam room. When I would walk in, and in the midst of overwhelming circumstances, life chaos, history of trauma, economic poverty, social oppression, lack of housing, little children littering the exam room, and feeling even in many cases a sense of powerlessness over the scope of it. But what I experienced in those rooms was that God had blessed these individuals with a resilience and with a strength that I could never muster on my best day. It was so palpable. I can't tell you how palpable it was. And it wasn't a sense of pity. I did not feel pity for people at all. It wasn't out of my own compassion, because by nature, I'm a New Yorker. I'm not very compassionate. But it was at a sense of a recognition that God was at work in these individuals' lives in the midst of their circumstances. It was as if I could sense his presence there. And more than that, as I participated in their suffering, whether it was just the simple act of listening or the simple act of advocacy, from a position of power. I've got power. I've got social capital. I've got a degree. I've got connections. I have knowledge. Just by extending the little power that I had, I experienced Shalom for the first time in my life. Because Shalom was the fact that my brother or my sister was well with me and in that room, that I could extend and participate with them in what they were going through. And that was the right thing. That was the presence of righteousness in the room. Deeply transforming for me. Time after time after time, room after room. Trust me, it's the only thing that kept me going. Because after a while, you hear so many horrible stories, you can crack. But in me, there was this persistent sense that I was participating. I was, in a sense, being an agent of Shalom. And you know what? And the scriptures actually detail this in particular. Reread Isaiah 58. And it says that when you do participate in Shalom, and it describes what Shalom looks like in very practical terms. You don't have to kind of over-spiritualize these passages. They are very, very clear. Right? If you take care of your workers and don't oppress them, if you take care of the widows and the orphans, if you share what you have, Shalom will come to you. That's what Isaiah 58 says. You're the one that's going to experience the blessing, because in order for Shalom to exist, everybody's got to be in a state of Shalom. As long as there is the state of poverty, the state of oppression, Shalom has not reached its full potential. And that's why Jesus found himself there as well. That's why he intentionally aligned himself with those communities. Now, if I was a listener at the beginning of my time at Wheaton, listening into this, I know what I would have been thinking, because I did think about it at some points during my time here. Again, another confession for the video camera. I would have thought, you know what, that sounds like a lot of liberal stuff, right? That sounds like what those people on the outside do. Right? You see how this in and out thing is so dangerous when it begins to define your worldview? You know, it went so far as to really affect, my engagement here at Wheaton with the sciences, with the science of psychology in particular. Again, I told you that I expected a Christian psychology to be here. I expected to find a package deal there. I didn't find it. I didn't find it because there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a Christian psychology. I'm not sure there should be. From the perspective of Shalom, I'm not saying that everybody needs to go out and work in the Lawndale neighborhood. This is a wonderful thing about the narrative that God talks about in the scriptures. See, God is restoring everything. Everything. So if you're an artist and you were made to create art, then you better create art, because that's the beauty that you're bringing to the world, to Shalom. That's your piece of Shalom. Right? Not everybody's going to end up in an inner city urban neighborhood working. But everyone must be a participant in the Shalom project. That's who we are by definition. And that's actually the distinctive that we can bring to every endeavor, every sphere of life. That's what we can bring, that we operate out of this desire, out of this motivation, out of this power of the Shalom project. Now, this affected, as I said, my engagement with science. I didn't really like Aaron Beck when I was here. I'm not sure why. I think it's because he was kind of a stiff white guy, I think, And I was like, I'm not sure I connect with this guy very much. But, I look back and I think, well, Aaron Beck, who's the developer of cognitive behavioral therapy, that's had a profound impact on modern psychology, right? He was participating in the Shalom project. Whether he knew it or not, he was participating in the Shalom project because he explicated a core fundamental of human behavior, that thoughts impact feeling and behavior. And that's a key aspect of how our Creator created us. And Beck, a scientist, discovered it, explicated it, researched it, worked it out. And it's praiseworthy. This is part of the Shalom project. Aaron Beck was who God made him to be, at least in this aspect of his life. Right? So if that's the case, that means that maybe we don't have this kind of access to specialized knowledge that we often think we do, or at least from this in-out perspective, right? Because a presupposition of the in-out thing is, well, I'm in, therefore I have this special knowledge that I'm going to bring to the world, and therefore, in a way, what I bring should be in some ways better, or at least distinctive. And, you know, where I've landed on this is I don't really believe Christians have a special advantage in the sciences. I don't think we have some kind of storehouse of special information, particularly if you don't consider the scriptures a science textbook, that the world can't get at in many ways on its own. And I base this based on the fact that, particularly in psychology, Christians have not produced any significant alternative finding. All right? And, most frustrating enough for me during my time here at Wheaton, many of the obvious Christian ones that we probably should have pounced on because it's a big part of our worldview, it wasn't us. The folks who do the forgiveness research, they're not believers. The folks who do the positive psychology, I thought that one should have come from us, right? Shalom, we can bring, right? No. Even acceptance and commitment therapy, a more recent format that talks explicitly about values and helping patients commit to values as a way of working through and accepting suffering in their life. Right? Buddhists, not believers. So, you know, we're not going to bring a Christian psychology to the world. What we're going to bring is the Shalom Project. That is the true Christian distinctive. We believe that God is an impartial God. He doesn't play favorites. But you know what? We are partial. If a beautiful person, if a rich person enters a room, our heads turn. If a person who's poorly dressed, with very little social capital walks into the room, our instinct is to shrink back. We're partial creatures. But God is not partial. But because he sees that we're partial creatures, he places special emphasis and protection on the poor and the vulnerable in society. He is there. And I'll tell you, there are many days when I drove into the neighborhood of Lawndale and I just said, wow, God is just here. And he's here in a way that feels different than many of the other places I've been in. He's just here. He compensates for our shortcomings. But he doesn't want to leave it at that, obviously. He wants us to identify with the poor, to become part of bringing shalom to us. It's not just to them. It's to us. Because again, I can only experience shalom if my brother and sister is right, and we are right together. So, I know it seems perhaps a little long-winded, and in fact it is a little long-winded, but all of this comes back to where I landed in primary care. I had no idea that this is what I was going to do, but it makes a whole lot of sense to me now. Primary care is likely the best, most strategic location to work with the underserved. Why? Well, it's well-funded. It's much more well-funded than mental health will ever be. 2, that's where people show up. Of all those folks who have mental illness in any given year, it's estimated that about 80% of them will have a visit with their primary care physician. Right? So all those folks, those 50% that are not being served, they're still going to see their primary care docs. But they're not showing up at the doorstep of the local counseling center or the community mental health center. And in the model that we work in, we intentionally want to make sure that we create access for all those who need it. And do it in a way that meets their needs. I'll tell you, and I'll finish up with this example. One of the most powerful encounters I've had was with an elder. I wouldn't say he's elderly. He was probably in his late 60s. He looked elderly just because life had beaten him up. he was a grandfather, African-American man, who was a patient of one of the physicians at our clinic. And the physician had picked up on some depression. I believe the man was having difficulty managing his diabetes and his overall health. And I remember now that the specific referral question was that he wasn't sleeping well. So I walk in to talk with this man. Now, first of all, an African-American man talking to me, a shrink, is a huge leap. You could have given this guy $100, he wouldn't have gone seeing someone at the local counseling center. This guy was a battle-hardened individual, tough, gruff as they come. I was able to establish some rapport with this man, and we figured out together that the reason he wasn't sleeping was because he had a history of heroin addiction, had been sober for 15 years, but he was caring for his son's son. His son was in prison, and he was raising his grandson. And he was so afraid that either he would do something wrong in his parenting. He was so afraid that something would happen to this young man that he couldn't sleep. I mean, he literally could not sleep. He wanted to protect this young, beautiful 6-year-old. And when he allowed me to come and be a part of his life, by talking about this, I didn't do very much. I mean, we might have worked on a couple of behavioral strategies here or there, but most of what I did was say, don't worry, you're the best kind of parent there is. The kind that cares and worries for your kid. Don't worry, we'll work on it together. I'll see you in a couple of weeks. When that guy shook my hand, and his hand was much larger than mine, much thicker and much more heavily calloused, that was Shalom. So I hope that you can see why this meandering set of thoughts from the kid who showed up here as a young Pentecostal bothered my teachers to no end. I thank my teachers here at Wheaton because they suffered with me through many in-class conversations that reflected my immaturity. Through those kind of experiences with those kind of brothers and sisters, where, praise God, Shalom came to me. I want to end by giving you a visual of the young man. I like visuals. Hoping this one shows up. No? Oh, it's too bad. It's a picture of me when I first came here to Wheaton, and I'll just kind of visually describe it to you because I think it's pretty funny. First of all, I look insanely young. I tend to have Latino features, so I still look insanely young. But I'm holding up a bottle of wine in one hand. Well, actually, it's not a bottle of wine. It's actually a bottle of alcohol-free wine because I was here at Wheaton. And it's my 21st birthday. I'm in a New York Giants shirt. And I look back at that young man, and I think, God has been good to that guy. God has protected that guy, and he's blessed him tremendously. And in many ways, I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to Wheaton College. Because that young man that showed up that day, he didn't have a clue. But Shalom did come to me, and Shalom will come to you. If you're able to grasp the breadth of the scriptural narrative, the breadth and depth of Christ's love for all, and his passion to bring shalom, shalom will come to you just as it came to me. Thank you very much for your attention. A couple of quickies here for those of you who are interested in primary care in particular. I have a website, and I don't get any money if you click there or anything. It's just for resource for students who might be interested, or professionals interested in learning about it. It's called primarycareshrink.com, and there's links there to many other websites throughout the web on this growing phenomenon. Thank you again for your kind attention today, and especially on a beautiful day like this. You all